Good afternoon. This is Kiana, and today we are going to be going over the discussion that Vivek Ramaswamy had with protesters outside of the Democratic National Convention. So this is really just an extemporaneous video that I'm going to be doing. I am going to be pulling from some, uh, you know, from this book here, which is called "When Sorry Isn't Enough: The Controversy Over Apologies and Reparations for Human Injustice." Yes, I will be pulling from this book, but it's really just like an extemporaneous video and going to be academic based. And there may be some specks of uh, political and legal arguments in here, but again, this is not going to be legal advice. So let's go ahead and get into it. So during Vivek Ramaswamy's discussion with protesters, he argues that if the United States brings back racial reparations, it actually causes greater harm. So it was just a statement that he made to a question that was asked of him. And although he makes this statement, he concedes that there has been a wave of anti-Black racism and other forms of racism in the United States. But he ends his argument by saying, if you take something away from someone because of their skin color, that fosters racial animus. Now, I'm of the opinion that this is a badly constructed argument because first, I don't think that if you take something away from someone because of their skin color, that's going to foster racial animus. It may foster the feelings of injustice, the feelings of grievance, the feelings of inhumanity, man's inhumanity to man. So I think that this is what people feel. There's a feeling of frustration and oppression when you're taking something away from someone because of their skin color. Now, Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't tell us who he's talking about, what group of people he is talking about in this conclusion. So I'm really just not going to infer. This would be an interesting discussion to have with Ramaswamy on reparations and to really dive in deeply into this discussion. It would be a discussion that I would not mind having with Ramaswamy, but at any rate, I disagree with his argument. I think that the conclusion actually undermines his thesis. Of course, that thesis is that if we bring back racial reparations, it actually causes greater discrimination. And my argument is no. We've seen throughout history that a number of groups have been raised the issue of reparations and just satisfaction and knowledge and compensation for past harms. My Jewish brothers and sisters in time have actually raised this argument when they were affected by the situation that happened in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And of course, we had the comfort women that were impacted by persecution and advocated for reparations. We have the Japanese Americans that have advocated for reparations and have been compensated for being placed in internment camps. We also have Native Americans who lost land and were compensated and received reparations because of this injustice. And then not last, but second to last, we have South Africans who actually are raising arguments about reparations as well because of apartheid. And if you understand what apartheid is, of course, it's a form of segregation. It's similar to the Jim Crow period in the United States. So, as you can see, a number of groups are raising reparations, the argument of reparations for past harms, and asking for a remedy. We have seen that Native Americans in the United States have raised this argument again, to reiterate, and have received land and have received compensation. And I think that actually put Native Americans on equal footing, maybe not 100%, but you know elevated their equality because of these past injustices. And so I think that, of course, Vivek Ramaswamy's argument is not well thought out, but of course, he was just asking a question, and maybe for ease of reference, or just because there was a small window period that he had to answer these or this question, he gave that answer. But moving on, we know that throughout history, there have been political figures on both sides of the aisle, on Republicans and Democrats, that have said that the United States should not apologize for reparations. We had Newt Gingrich, who is a Republican, and then we have Bill Clinton, who is a Democrat, and both politicians said that the United States shouldn't apologize for past injustices, namely the transatlantic slave trade. However, I believe that Bill Clinton did evolve in his thinking, and in the future decided, or excuse me, I think years after he said that in the 90s, he articulated that there should be an apology for reparations. And currently, moving forward, it's important to understand that right now there's a debate whether reparations it should be race-based or whether it should be lineage-based. And that is a discussion that we are going to have another time. But I am of the opinion that there is a lineage-based position that is efficacious when we are talking about reparations. And I'm going to talk about that later on when I bring up the Rosewood situation. But we're going to be reading from this book. It's called The Controversy Over Apologies, Reparations for Human Injustice When Sorry Just Isn't Enough. And it's edited by Roy L. Brooks. And so when we are talking about reparations, an interesting, the question that often comes up is whether reparations, whether it is constitutionally permissible, right? Whether the Constitution allows reparations to Black Americans, whether the Constitution, whether there's a remedy within the Constitution. And my argument is yes, and I base this argument on the chapter called The Constitutionality of Black Reparations by Boris Bitker and Roy L. Brooks. And so both authors, they state that although no precise formula has been developed, the court has held that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment permits states a wide scope of discretion in enacting laws which affect some group of citizens differently than others. The constitutional safeguard is offended only if the classification rests on grounds wholly irrelevant to the achievement of the state's objective. They go on to say that state legislatures are presumed to have acted within their constitutional power despite the fact that, in practice, the laws result in some inequality. A statutory discrimination will not be set aside if any state of facts reasonably may be conceived to justify it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start there. So let's start there. I feel that there is an argument for reparations in the form of repealing the qualified immunity doctrine. We understand that the qualified immunity doctrine in the United States gives police officer, government officials, federal officials immunity from civil litigation. And we understand that it also gives police officers immunity from civil litigation. And the reason why I feel that this doctrine should be repealed as a reparation is that Black Americans are disproportionately impacted by it. We're impacted by police violence in the United States, lethal use of violence. And so when there is an incident of lethal violence against Black Americans, often what happens is Black Americans seek to file a civil suit. And in some cases, those civil suits are thrown out of court through by way of this qualified immunity doctrine. And so we understand that in order for a doctrine, legislation, in order for it to persist, the state needs to show that there is a compelling governmental interest for it, and that this law is narrowly tailored to achieve, of course, that governmental interest. And I'm sure that the United States has a long argument for how this law, this qualified immunity doctrine, is narrowly tailored to achieve a governmental interest. So it's to protect, in their opinion, this is probably what they'll argue, that qualified immunity protects governmental officials, doing their job, because if qualified immunity doctrine didn't exist, A, B, C, D, and E. There's all these arguments that could be raised to support this doctrine. However, again, I am of the opinion that this doctrine is very harmful for Black Americans because we're disproportionately impacted by police violence in the United States. And so I think that under the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, Black Americans could argue, hey, like there is an inequality because when compared to other groups, and because we only make up 13-14% of the population, like we're largely impacted by this kind of violence. And because we're impacted, we're unequal, because we're impacted more than other groups, we're unequal. And because we're unequal, this violates the 14th Amendment. So I think that is like the first, the first step to take when receiving reparations, when it comes to equality, right? And there are other arguments as well. And so going back to the transatlantic slave trade, there has been definitely an argument that has been raised by the dominant society today that is saying, hey, like, we didn't do anything. We didn't enslave Black Americans. We didn't segregate Black Americans. This wasn't us doing it. That was our ancestors, right? And so Joe R. Fagan and Ellen O'Brien, in their chapter, The Long Overdue Reparations for African Americans, actually addresses this argument. And so we're going to do that. And so a common argument against significant economic reparations for African Americans concedes their suffering and loss under Jim Crow, but points out the most whites who perpetuated such atrocities are either unalived or either passed away or elderly. Furthermore, it is impossible, this is the argument that they make, to determine who most of the perpetrators were, how much damage was done, and to whom. So this is the argument that the dominant society makes against reparations. And so, like I said, they often state that I never segregated Blacks. This was done by my distant ancestors. It wasn't me. Why should I have to pay? And again, when we're looking at remedy, it's really not the taxpayers that are paying for reparations. It's this is being done through the Constitution, so it's not a tax on the citizen population. And so, thank so Fagan and O'Brien, to address this argument, they state that argument, what it does is it obscures reality, because in the first place, the claim of innocence is often factually incorrect because many in the dominant societies still discriminate against African Americans in a variety of ways. So discrimination can be blatant, subtle, and covert. And that's true. You know, there is discrimination where that is, we're dealing with microaggressions, and then there's extreme forms of it that is happening within the United States. And then there's covert ways, which is really insidious. And even if a particular person has not or does not engage in overt discrimination, most such individuals are the beneficiaries of what theirs and others, their ancestors, did in creating a system of racial oppression that, as they have demonstrated, persists today. So, as you can see, like, because racism hasn't been alleviated, as Vivek Ramaswamy concedes, he concedes that there is still a wave of anti-Black oppression in the United States. And because this racism and anti-Black oppression still exists today, that we're seeing, and that is having effects upon us, and there has not been a remedy, then we really need to address the issue of reparations. We need to ask ourselves, the United States, the US government needs to first ask itself, are Black Americans still oppressed in the United States? Is there still racial discrimination in the United States? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then this is prima facie evidence that there is an efficacious position for reparations. And so when we're thinking about reparations and when we're talking about this, we must ask ourselves, well, in history, like, can we look to something? Has there ever been a time in history where Black Americans received any compensation for a past injustice that is similar to the transatlantic slave trade? And that argument is yes, and we can look to the Rosewood incident in Florida. So we're going to be reading from Rosewood, which author Kenneth Nunn states that Rosewood was a small hamlet of about 350 souls, nestled 10 miles or so from the Gulf Coast in the pine scrub of North Florida. By all accounts, it was a prosperous town, an African American oasis in a predominantly white country. Rosewood had its own schools, 2 general stores, 3 churches, and much more. Some of the houses in Rosewood compared favorably to the finest houses in the neighboring white town, Sumner. Like the white residents of Sumner, most of the residents of Rosewood earned their living at the nearby sawmill. Others trapped furs or collected turpentine and other naval stores from the surrounding forests. And so this was during 1923, and during this time, this was before 1923, this was like in 1922, But in the 1920s and in 1923 is where there was an allegation that was made against a Black American man that stated that he allegedly violated the bodily integrity of this white woman. And so when that allegation was made, then what happened was that, the dominant society came out, and of course, this was an inaccurate and false allegation, but still what happened was that the dominant society came out and they just started to set to flame Rosewood and ethnically cleanse this particular area. And so Black Americans, of course, were impacted. The Rosewood residents were impacted by this violence that, really hurt a lot of people. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how is this similar to the slave, or how was the transatlantic slave trade similar to this Rosewood incident? Because we're going to get into the Compensation Act. Well, it was similar because those same allegations were made against enslaved African men during the slavery era. And also, we understand that after when African Americans were freed from slavery, similar situations happened, right? So before the Reconstruction era, while African Americans were gaining their freedom, and even under the slavery era, what was happening is that the communities that, or even on the plantation that Black Americans lived in, were often set up in flames. So that's how that is similar to the Rosewood incident. And so years later, Florida recognized this injustice in 1994 and decided to enact the Rosewood Compensation Act. And so what did this act do? So first, the state of Florida officially acknowledged the community of Rosewood was destroyed by violence and accepted state responsibility for failing to prevent the destruction. Second, a criminal investigation of these events were required. Third, families were compensated for real and personal property loss. Each family was eligible for a payment for up to $20,000, which could be increased to up to $100,000 for actual losses shown. Fourth, any African American residents of Rosewood who were present and affected by the violence that took place were eligible for an additional payment for up to $150,000. Now you may say, well, Kiana, no African American today, descendant of slave, was, so all of the descendants of slaves today didn't go through slavery. They weren't enslaved. They didn't experience the kind of persecution and oppression that their ancestors did. But just wait a minute, we're going to get to that. And so fifth, a Rosewood Family Scholarship Fund was established to provide individual grants for up to $4,000 to cover tuition fees and other fees for post-secondary education. The 25 yearly scholarships were to be made available to minority persons with preference, given to direct descendants of Rosewood families. So you can see there is a preference that is given to the Rosewood families, the descendants of the Rosewood families that were impacted by this kind of violence. So to bring this argument full circle is the Rosewood family descendant, or the families of the descendants of the Rosewood incident, they received preference and reparations for the harms that happened to their ancestors. And because they received it, Black Americans who are descendants of slaves should also receive this kind of compensatory remedy for being, of course, descendants of the slave trade, but the negative impacts and the economic instability that has caused to Black Americans. So we understand that during the slavery era, that Black Americans were used for their labor, and of course, Black Americans weren't compensated, and Black Americans were building entirely the United States, howsoever wasn't getting paid for it. Black Americans were unfortunately picking cotton and working on railroads and doing a number of laborious actions without getting compensated for it. And what this did was it actually enriched the communities, enriched the dominant society, and made them very wealthy. And so there is an economic instability there because Black Americans didn't get paid. Our ancestors didn't get paid for that labor. And so if they decided that they didn't want to work for free, if they decided that they wanted to escape the oppression, what often happened was that they were either unfortunately lynched or unalived. If they were lucky enough to make it off of the plantation, there was a fugitive slave warrant that was sent out or made against them. And so they had slave patrols that came and took the victim back to the plantation to work. And if they were taken back to the plantation, they suffered brutal beatings by whippings and much more atrocities. So as you can see, Black Americans are impacted by this era of injustice and persecution, and there still hasn't been a remedy from the United States to actually address it appropriately. So this is just a concise argument in a response to Vivek Ramaswamy's argument that race reparations, in my personal opinion, that it would not cause further discrimination. I think what it would do, it would actually alleviate the discrimination because there hasn't been any atonement for the past injustices that our ancestors have endured in the United States of America. So I'm Kiana Canada. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Kiana_Canada. That is Kiana_Canada. You can also view my Facebook page by clicking into the description on my main YouTube channel. It has my Facebook link there, or just by typing in Kiana Canada. I recently saw that I typed in Kiana Canada and my Facebook page didn't come up, so I did put a link in my YouTube account. And so you can also follow me here at Real Kiana Canada, at Real Kiana Canada. Look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.